contract was still in my name. He just didn't know I knew that. It was a Tuesday when my husband told me he wanted a divorce. Not a Saturday after a fight, not a Sunday morning with coffee going cold between us, a Tuesday. He came home from work, loosened his tie the way he always did, and said he needed to talk. I remember thinking someone had died. In a way, someone had. We'd been married for 23 years. I was 44 years old, sitting at the kitchen island where I'd eaten breakfast every morning for the past decade, in the house we'd bought together when the kids were small and the future felt endless. He sat across from me and said the words carefully, like he'd rehearsed them. He said he'd been unhappy for a long time. He said he needed space to figure out who he was. He said he hoped we could do this with dignity. I didn't cry. I think that surprised him. I asked him if there was someone else. He paused just a half second too long, and that pause told me everything the words after it didn't. He said no. I nodded. I picked up my coffee mug, realized it was empty, and set it back down. Okay, I said. Just that. Okay. He looked at me like he expected a scene. Maybe he wanted one. Maybe it would have made things easier for him if I'd screamed, if I'd strewn something. He could have walked out feeling justified. But I just sat there with my empty mug and my quiet okay, and after a moment, he went upstairs to the guest room and closed the door. I sat at that island for 2 hours in the dark. Let me tell you who I was before this, because it matters. I was 21 when I met my husband at a trade show in Atlanta. He was charming and funny and had a gap between his front teeth that I thought was the most endearing thing I'd ever seen. He was trying to launch a small manufacturing business, custom cabinetry, high-end residential, and he had enormous ideas and almost no money. I had a degree in accounting, a decent job at a mid-sized firm, and apparently very poor instincts about men. We got married 2 years later. I was the one who handled the books from the start. Not because he asked me to, because I offered. Because I believed in what he was building, and I was good with numbers and it made sense. For the first 4 years of the business, I did the accounting on evenings and weekends while working full-time, while raising our daughter, while doing every ordinary, unglamorous thing that keeps a life from falling apart. The business grew. By the time our daughter was in middle school, it had grown into something real. 3 locations, 15 employees, contracts with luxury developers across the Southeast. We brought on a proper accounting firm eventually, a real CFO, and I stepped back from the day-to-day. But in those early years, I was the one who kept the lights on, literally once. There was a winter where we couldn't make payroll, and I emptied my personal savings account without telling him how close we'd come to losing everything. I never told him that. I didn't want him to feel like I was keeping score. That was my first mistake. The second was not reading the fine print on the partnership agreement we signed in year 3, when his college friend came on as a silent partner. That friend dropped out 18 months later, bought out, gone, amicable. But I was the one who'd been listed as co-signatory on the original operating agreement, because at the time, the bank required 2 signatures and my credit was better than my husband's. When the friend left, nobody redrafted anything. Nobody transferred my signature. Nobody thought to remove my name. I didn't think about it for years. Until the Tuesday in the kitchen. I didn't fall apart right away. I want to be honest about that. The first few weeks, I functioned. I made coffee, I went to work, I called my daughter at college on Sunday nights the way I always had. I didn't tell her what was happening. She was in her junior year, studying for finals, and I wasn't going to drop this on her over the phone. My husband and I moved around each other like furniture. He stayed in the guest room. He was polite. He even made dinner once, spaghetti, which he left on the stove with a note that said I made extra, as if we were roommates, as if 23 years had dissolved into a sticky note on a pot of pasta. I found out about her 6 weeks later. Her name doesn't matter. She was 31 years old and worked in the marketing department of one of their biggest clients. I found out, the way wives always find out. Not through any dramatic confrontation, but through a credit card statement I happened to open before he got to the mail. A hotel in Savannah. A weekend he told me was a contractor conference. I sat with that statement for a long time. Then I did something I'd never done in 23 years of marriage. I called a lawyer. Her name was Joanna, and she came recommended by a woman I'd met in a Pilates class 2 years earlier who had gone through a brutal divorce and come out the other side clear-eyed and fine. Joanna was 50-something, wore reading glasses on a chain, and had a very particular way of listening. Completely still, eyes on you, not writing anything down. It made you feel like she was memorizing you. I told her everything. The marriage, the business, the Tuesday, the hotel receipt. She asked me questions I hadn't thought to ask myself. Did I have any ownership interest in the business? Not formally, I said. I'd never drawn a salary, never taken an equity stake. I gave her what I remembered about the operating agreement from year 3. She went quiet for a moment, then she said, "Do you still have that document?" I didn't, but it was a business filing, public record. She found it in 2 days. The original operating agreement for the company listed 2 managing members, my husband and his college friend, and 1 co-signatory with authority over financial obligations, me. When the friend was bought out, the operating agreement was amended, but only to remove his interest. My name, my signature authority, my standing as a financial co-signatory had never been formally removed. The amendment had been filed carelessly, by a business attorney who apparently didn't consider the full implications. Joanna set her glasses down on her desk and looked at me. "Depending on how this is interpreted," she said carefully, "you may have standing here that your husband doesn't know about." I asked her what that meant in plain English. She smiled, just slightly. "It means he may need your signature to do certain things with this company. Things he might be planning to do very soon, now that a divorce is in motion." I drove home slowly. I made myself dinner. I didn't say a word to my husband. I was very, very still. Here's what I learned over the next few months from Joanna and from documents she obtained through discovery. My husband had been planning this for longer than I'd known. He and the woman from the marketing department had been together for almost 2 years. He had already spoken to his own attorney about restructuring the business, consolidating assets, potentially moving the primary location to a new LLC, in a way that would have dramatically reduced what appeared on paper as marital property subject to division. He was going to walk away with the business mostly intact and give me the house and a settlement that, while not nothing, was nowhere near what 23 years of my labor had actually built. Joanna explained to me what my options were. Some of them I was uncomfortable with. Some of them felt like revenge, and I didn't want revenge. I want to be clear about that. I didn't want to burn anything down. I just didn't want to be left with nothing, which is what he was quietly arranging. What I wanted was what was fair. What was fair turned out to be protected accidentally by a filing error from 15 years ago and a name on a document that had never been removed. I won't go into all the legal specifics because honestly they're complicated and I still don't fully understand the nuances. What I understood was this: when my husband's attorney went to execute the restructuring plan, moving assets into a new LLC, reclassifying certain company interests, they discovered that the original operating agreement created an obstacle. A co-signatory whose consent they needed, one who had not been notified, not been consulted, and who had her own attorney, who was very aware of the situation. His attorney called Joanna. There was a conversation I was not part of. Joanna called me afterward and said simply, "They want to talk." The mediation was on a Thursday morning in a conference room in downtown Atlanta. My husband was already there when I arrived. He looked tired. He also looked, for the first time in months, uncertain. Not the man who had sat across the kitchen island with his rehearsed words and his polished calm. Something had shifted. I sat down. I said good morning. He didn't say anything. The mediator was a retired judge named Harold, dry and efficient, who had clearly seen worse. We went through the documents. The attorneys talked. At one point, my husband said something under his breath. I didn't catch all of it, just the word unbelievable, and his attorney put a hand on his arm. It took most of the day. By 4 o'clock, we had an agreement. I won't say I got everything, I did it, but I got significantly more than the original settlement he'd proposed. I got a real share of the business value, not the business itself, I didn't want it, based on an honest appraisal. I got the house, unencumbered. And I got something I hadn't expected to fight for, but did. A letter, signed by my husband, acknowledging my contribution to the business in its early years. Not for any legal reason. Just for the record, just so it existed. Joanna said she'd never seen anyone ask for that before. I said I just wanted something in writing. After 23 years, I wanted something that said I'd been there. I called my daughter that night. I told her everything. About the divorce, about the woman, about the legal process, all of it. She was quiet on the phone for a long moment, and then she said, "Mom, why didn't you tell me sooner?" I said I didn't want to worry her during finals. She made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and something else. "Mom," she said, "you handled all of this by yourself during final season and you're worried about me." I didn't have an answer for that. She came home the following weekend. She slept in her old room, and on Saturday morning she made pancakes without being asked, and we sat at the same kitchen island where my husband had delivered his careful words, and we ate and talked, and I let myself be a little undone, finally. I cried some, which I hadn't let myself do in months. She didn't say anything comforting or useless. She just passed me more coffee and let me be. That was the moment I started to feel like something was going to be okay. My ex-husband and the woman from the marketing department got engaged 4 months after the divorce was finalized. I heard about it from a mutual acquaintance who delivered the news with the tone of someone who expected me to be devastated. I wasn't. I was at a farmer's market in Decatur, holding a bunch of radishes I didn't know what to do with, and I said, "Oh, good for them," and meant it in the most neutral way possible. They did not last, as it turned out. I don't know the details, and I don't need to. What I know is that when the restructuring he planned for the business didn't go the way he'd intended, when the new LLC absorbed more debt than projected, and the housing market softened, and 2 of the luxury developers he'd been counting on pulled back their contracts, things got harder for him. Not ruinous, but harder. That's not why I tell that part. I don't tell it as a victory. I tell it because someone once asked me if I felt like the universe evened things out, and I thought about it honestly and said I don't think the universe keeps score. I think consequences are mostly just math. He made decisions and the math worked out the way math does. I kept the house for a year and then sold it. It was too big and too full of the particular silence of a life that used to be louder. I bought a smaller place in a neighborhood I'd always liked, with a porch I actually use and a kitchen with a window over the sink, which sounds like nothing but which I think about every morning when the light comes in. I went back to working full-time, which I hadn't done since our daughter was small. I took a position at a nonprofit doing financial oversight, different from corporate accounting, slower in some ways, but the work feels like it means something. My colleagues are, on the whole, people who chose this work deliberately, and that creates a different kind of room to be in. I started running again, which I'd given up somewhere in my late 30s. Nothing serious. A few miles, 3 mornings a week. I let my hair go. I've been coloring it since my mid-30s, and I just stopped. And it grew out silver gray over about a year, and now I look in the mirror and see someone who looks exactly like herself. I don't know how else to describe it. My daughter graduated in May. I flew up alone, which felt strange for about 10 minutes, and then felt fine. I sat in the bleachers in the sunshine with her aunt, my sister, and we wore sunscreen and drank terrible coffee and cheered embarrassingly loud when her name was called, and it was one of the best days I've had in years. She's starting a job in September. She has her own apartment, her own life, her own early mornings. I'm proud of her in the way that makes it hard to talk about, because the words always feel smaller than the feeling. I think about that Tuesday sometimes. The empty mug, the kitchen island, his careful words. I think about how I sat there in the dark for 2 hours and felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. I think about how I almost took the first settlement without looking at it closely, how I almost let the whole thing happen to me the way it was designed to. I didn't because of a woman in a Pilates class who gave me a name, because of a lawyer who listened without writing anything down, Because of a filing error from 15 years ago made by a careless attorney who left my name on a document. You build a life the same way you build anything, one ordinary decision at a time. Some of those decisions don't pay off for years. Some of them pay off in ways you never expected. And some of the ones that save you are ones you made so long ago you'd forgotten you made them at all. I didn't ruin him. I didn't want to. I just stood in the place I'd always occupied, the one nobody had thought to reassign, and let the paperwork do what paperwork does. He signed the agreement with a pen he brought himself. I watched him do it. He didn't look at me. I looked at him, though, just for a moment. 23 years is a long time, and it isn't nothing, and I'm not made of stone. Then I picked up my copy and put it in my bag, and I walked out into an October afternoon in Atlanta, and the air smelled like leaves turning, and I thought, okay, now what? It turns out that question, now what, is the best one there is. It means there's still something ahead of you. It means you're not done. I'm not done. I keep coming back to that filing error. 15 years old, made by an attorney who probably billed 2 hours and never thought about it again. A clerical oversight. A name left on a document nobody remembered to update. And that small forgotten thing ended up being the thing that protected me when everything else fell apart. I don't think that's magic. I don't think it was fate or the universe intervening on my behalf. I think it was something simpler and harder to argue with. I had done the work. I had signed my name to something because I showed up, because my credit was better, because I was the one holding things together while he was still figuring out how to hold himself together. That signature existed because I was there, and I was there because that's who I am. That's what I've been sitting with, if I'm honest. There's a kind of person who does the right thing quietly, without keeping score, without expecting to be repaid. I was that person for 23 years. And for a long time in those first weeks after the Tuesday, when I was eating alone and going through credit card statements and learning words like operating agreement and co-signatory, I wondered if that had been a mistake, if the decent thing and the smart thing were 2 different roads and I had taken the wrong one. I don't think that anymore. Being decent isn't naive. It's a long game. The years I spent showing up honestly, for the business, for my daughter, for a marriage that turned out to be something other than what I thought it was, those years built something real. Not just the legal standing that Joanna found in a public filing, something in me. A kind of steadiness. When the floor dropped out, I didn't collapse into bitterness. I made an appointment with a lawyer. I read the documents. I asked the questions I should have asked 15 years ago and learned it wasn't too late. That's the thing about intelligence. Not the credential kind, but the kind that says, look closer, ask again. Don't assume someone else is handling this. I had spent decades being good at other people's problems and not nearly careful enough about my own. That changed on a Tuesday night, sitting alone in a dark kitchen. Something clarified. I started paying attention in a different way. And then there's the part I don't talk about as much because it sounds too simple. I kept going. Through the mediation, through the months of not knowing, through the particular loneliness of dismantling a life while still living inside it. Joanna kept telling me the process would be exhausting, and she was right, and I kept showing up anyway. That's not heroism. That's just refusing to stop. My daughter does the same thing. I see it in her. And I wonder sometimes if that's the thing I actually gave her. Not the house, or the college fund, or the Sunday phone calls. The example of a woman who didn't quit when quitting would have been easier. I signed my name to a contract in year 3 of a small business because I believed in something and I had better credit. I didn't know that signature would still matter 15 years later. You never know which decisions will matter. So you make them honestly. You show up, you pay attention, and you don't let anyone convince you that the quiet, careful, decent version of yourself is the weak one. She's the one who got you here.